Hi, students, and welcome back to the Sound of Science. Today, we're going to be talking about what happens in populations undergoing evolution. So, I want you to focus on a couple of things in particular. I want you to focus on the vocabulary, there's quite a bit of it, and I really want you to focus on the patterns that I'm going to talk about and when those patterns manifest. I'm going to go through these very, very quickly. But as always, you have the power. You can pause this video, you can reverse it, you can rewatch any segment you need to until you understand. And please, please, please make sure that you are listening as you are watching, or at least using the captions. This will help you make sure you get all the information. Not everything is going to appear on the slides. To start, let's talk about some vocabulary terms. And the first one I want to cover is species. This is going to be a group of organisms that is able to breed together, and then the offspring that they produce is fertile, which just means that organisms can have babies together, and those babies one day can have babies of their own. That's all that means. We do have some situations where we sort of force organisms to produce babies, like lions and tigers, but ligers are not fertile. They're not able to have babies of their own, and therefore lions and tigers are not part of the same species. Sexual selection happens when we see one sex of a species prefer a specific characteristic. Okay, so let me explain. Peacocks, which is the male peafowl, have these giant, brightly colored tails that they shake all the time. These tails are really not helpful when trying to survive. I mean, remember, peacocks are sort of prey items, and so they need to be able to escape, they need to be able to fly, and having these giant, massive tails not only is expensive to them because they have to take in enough energy to produce these tails, but it also makes them more of a target. It's harder for them to get away from predators. However, peahens, the females of the peafowl, love brightly colored large tails. That's what they're attracted to. So the peacocks that have brightly colored large tails are the ones that are going to reproduce. They're the ones that are having babies. The peacocks that have sort of drab tails are not reproducing, and therefore their genes are not getting passed on to the next generation. That's why peacocks continue to have these giant, come eat me tails. The gene pool. Gene pool is just literally an accounting of all the alleles that are present, whether they're dominant or recessive, whether we really see them or not. They're all of the alleles that are in a population. And the reason that we count the ones that aren't being expressed currently is because they can still be passed on to the next generation. Let's talk allele frequency. This just means the number of times a specific allele is present. And we usually give this as a percentage. So the example I have here, 25 mice have a total of 20 B alleles and 30 little b alleles. Now, if you have 25 mice, how are we getting 20 plus 30, 50 alleles? Well, remember, you're going to always have two, one from mom, one from dad. So these 25 mice have this 20 big B alleles, 30 little b alleles. The frequency is going to be a percentage. So we would take the total number of alleles, in this case 50, and we're going to determine the percentage based on that total. So 40% are big B alleles, 60% are little b alleles. I have an example down here for you to try. Population of 50 mice this time, 30 big B alleles, 70 little b alleles. What's the allele frequency for each? Well, if we take the total number of alleles, which is 100, and we determine the percentage based on that, 30 out of 100 gives us 30%. 70 out of 100 gives us 70%. So those should be the alleles that we have. Those are our allele frequencies. Variation. If we don't have variation, all organisms have the same advantage or disadvantage. Natural selection can't occur. So that means if every individual is exactly like every other individual, then they all have an equal chance of surviving or not. The only time natural selection can work is when we have variation in the population. There have to be differences, even if those differences are slight. Variation can occur due to several processes. We're actually going to talk about those processes. It's important to understand what increases variation in a population. By the way, the more variation a population has, the more likely it is to survive a major cataclysmic event or a major change in the environment. So variation is something that should be encouraged. It's something that's good. Variation. Increasing variation. The first way we increase variation is going to be with mutation. Sometimes mutations are neutral. Sometimes they're harmful, but sometimes they can be helpful. And those helpful mutations may get passed on to the next generation. That may produce a helpful variant. Genetic recombination during sexual reproduction is another way that we can increase the variation in a population. And this just means that the genes that you got, whether it's a gene from mom or a gene from dad, that when your own gametes are forming, those genes sort of get mixed together. So you may have some of mom's genes or some of dad's genes that you were given. They may occur together in the same gamete and get passed on. So that's something to keep in mind. Crossing over is also part of that recombination. So crossing over occurs during meiosis, of course, when the tetrads are lined up. And this increases variation even more because we actually have, in this case, alleles that as they line up, they're actually swapping some genes with one another. So you may end up with an entire chromosome that was given to you by your dad, but you even have a little bit of mom's DNA on it. And so that increases variation in the population. And then one of my favorites, lateral gene flow. This is literally when bacteria hang out with each other. They actually can share DNA with each other, which is kind of cool. So bacteria can actually take a little plasmid and they can give it to other bacteria in the area, and it doesn't hurt them. And typically, as long as there is not a situation where they're fighting over resources, this is something that bacteria do quite often, and it's something that's helpful to bacteria. This is also not super great for humans because this is one of the ways that we actually see antibiotic resistance spread. Bacteria that become antibiotic resistant can share that resistance, share that gene with other bacteria that are nearby. I have this slide included because this makes one of the most important points about evolution. Evolution doesn't happen to an individual. I know in Pokemon, the Pokemon can evolve, right? And that's one individual Pokemon. That's not how evolution works in the real world. In the real world, evolution occurs literally through generations. So what you see here is an initial population of lizards, and most of them are that sort of greenish brown color. We have one bright red lizard, and we have one or 10% of really dark lizards. Over the course of 10 generations, we completely lose the allele for red lizards. Why? Well, because the predators that eat this lizard are going to be able to see the red lizard very well. And so it's going to get eaten first. It's too difficult for it to camouflage. But the very dark colored lizards actually blend in nicely. And so those dark colored lizards end up surviving better. They live longer, and ultimately they're going to end up having more babies. They're leaving more babies behind. And of course, as we've seen, typically babies are going to look like their parents. They have the same genes, the genes that get passed down. So by 10 generations, we're now 20% dark lizards with 80% green-brown lizards. 10 more generations pass, and we see another 10% change. 30% dark lizards, 70% green-brown lizards. By generation 30, we're now down to 40% of those green-brown lizards and 60% dark lizards. This is because the dark lizards are better adapted and more capable of survival. That means they're having more babies. They're leaving more offspring behind. That means their genes are appearing in more individuals than the genes from other less well adapted individuals. But none of this happened overnight. In fact, we're talking 30 generations of lizards before we see these major changes. So keep in mind that when we're talking about evolution, we're not talking about something that's occurring quickly. Evolution takes time. It takes a lot of time. And again, it's going to be based on the length of the generation. So for instance, bacteria, they reproduce every 20 minutes to 2 hours to 4 hours, depending on their conditions, but they're reproducing quite often, several times a day. That means their generations are very short and they actually evolve very quickly. Humans, on the other hand, our generations are 20 to 30 years and getting larger, by the way. And so because our generations are so large, it's going to take a lot longer for us to see major changes in our population. So please keep that in the back of your head. Pokemon's cool and all, but their system of evolution is not how it really works. This top picture that you can see right here, this is our normal distribution. That means that we have a range of fur color. Our phenotype occurs in a range. Normally what we see is just a distribution. We've got some lighter colored mice, and then they get gradually darker. And so we really have every color mouse in between. This is normal. This is the bell curve trend or the bell-shaped trend. If we look down here, though, we have 3 types of selection that can occur. And it really depends on the situation. Stabilizing selection means that the extreme variants, in this case, the very dark and the very light mice, are selected against, while the middle variants, the ones that are middle of the road, kind of a mix of both extremes, they're selected for. That means these mice are living longer and having more babies. They are leaving behind more of their DNA. So the alleles that make this color mouse is going to become more popular in the population. That means that these alleles that make a dark mouse or a light mouse are going to become more rare or less popular. This goes back to that allele frequency that we talked about and how important that allele frequency can be for determining our type of selection, what's really happening. This is typically going to be when the middle variant is the best adapted. Directional selection, same idea, except it's actually favoring an extreme instead of the middle variant. In this case, the darker mice are better adapted to their environment. They live longer, they have more babies, they leave more genes behind in the next generation. This means that these guys are going to start becoming more common in the population, while these guys that are being selected against are not very well adapted, are not having many babies, and their alleles are not getting passed on at the same rate. So over time, the population shifts in a single direction, usually to one extreme or the other. Disruptive selection is when you actually have selection that favors both extremes. And it's creating something which we call bimodal. Essentially what this means is that we have an environment that has light patches and dark patches. And so the lightest mice and the darkest mice are selected for. Well, the variants in the middle sort of stick out everywhere. They don't really fit in well. They're not well adapted. They're not leaving behind their alleles as frequently. So these end up being the 2 versions or 2 variants that we might see. You need to make sure that you understand the types of selection and when we would see each type of selection. If you don't, go back, listen again, make sure you understand it. And we're going to cover this a little bit in class as well. Okay, a couple more patterns that you might see. Drift and bottleneck. So we're going to start with drift first. Drift is when you have a very small population. Because your population is so small, Certain alleles actually get passed more often by chance. So let's say that we only have 3 individuals. And if we only have 3 individuals, then which genes get passed on really is not a reflection of what's happening in the population. It's just the fact that we have a really tiny sample size. So if one member of the population happens to die and it takes out an entire allele, then that's a problem. So that's drift. Drift is just small populations show large changes quickly. Bottleneck is really when you're getting into a population that's pretty large, and then suddenly most of the population dies. It could be some sort of catastrophic event. It could be a major environmental change if the population is found primarily in one location. We actually see this 10,000 years ago with cheetahs, and we suspect it's due to environmental change. But it means that as most of the population has died, very few get passed on to the next generation. So even though this original population that we're seeing here is a pretty even mix between orange and blue, once we have our major catastrophic event, which we're going to represent by saying, okay, we're going to shake just a couple out of the bottle, all those left in the bottle die. This is what's left. The allele frequency here is going to be very different. Here it's about 50-50. Here we have far more orange alleles than alleles that are giving us blue. So those surviving individuals are mostly orange, which means most of the population is actually going to be orange. So that's what we call bottleneck. It means that you don't have everything come out equally. Not an equal number of organisms, not an equal number of alleles survive whatever the catastrophic event was. Founder effect is also similar. Again, large population, and this time, instead of having some sort of catastrophic event that kills the rest of the population, just a few individuals from the population are actually going to leave that population, go somewhere else, and colonize. And it really depends on what organisms leave to go colonize. So for instance, if we look at this original population, we have gray, we've got yellow with spots, we've got red. And if we look here, founding population A only ends up with a couple of gray and a couple of yellow and spotted bugs. That means the descendants don't have any red at all. That red allele doesn't make it into this colony. This one, the same thing happens, only this time it's going to be with the gray. The gray doesn't make it. So you actually end up with two populations that look vastly different, despite all coming from the same population. We call this the founder effect. All of this is leading us to the process of speciation. Speciation is a process in which a new species arises from the isolation of members from the former population. So you basically start with one population, and for some reason, these individuals get separated. They get split into two populations, or one half of the population dies, leaving one part of the population there. Regardless, whatever happens, these two populations can no longer have babies together. There is some sort of barrier preventing them from producing offspring together. Over time, these populations are going to become further and further apart. They are going to become more and more different from one another until eventually, if you take two individuals from each of these new populations, you put them back together, they won't recognize each other as the same species, they won't mate, and they won't produce offspring. This we call speciation. Here are some of the barriers that can potentially prevent organisms from reproducing with one another. Most commonly talked about is geographical. This means some sort of physical barrier arises separating the population in half. Mountain range, a canyon, a river. Any of these things that literally come up in the middle of a population, they prevent the two sides of the population from interbreeding, can lead to this type of isolation. One of the famous examples is the Kaibab and the Albert squirrel. One lives on one side of the Grand Canyon, the other squirrel lives on the other side. But prior to the Grand Canyon forming, they were all one population. They interbred normally. Over time, as the canyon got wider, the ability for the squirrels to jump the canyon back and forth stopped. And when that happened, it was a speciation event. Now, if you take an Albert squirrel and a Kaibab squirrel and you stick them together, they don't recognize that they were ever part of the same species. Behavioral differences. Organisms won't reproduce because they have behavioral differences. This happens so often with birds. In particular, birds tend to have elaborate mating rituals where they have to dance a certain way or they have to sing certain songs or certain notes. And if they don't behave just right, that behavioral difference will actually prevent the two individuals from mating. This can happen as a result of a mutation. This can happen as a result of really a lot of different things. But regardless, the point is that that behavior changes, and because of that behavior, they now are reproductively isolated. Temporal isolation means that organisms can't reproduce because they're separated by time. And this really can have two meanings. The first is that an organism that usually reproduces at a certain time of year mutates and starts reproducing at a different time of year. So now it's not able to reproduce with its former population because they're mating at different times. The other thing that a temporal separation can be, or a temporal isolation, can mean that literally time has passed. So if you take, for instance, horses, we talked about how horses evolved over time. If we take the dawn horse, that little tiny horse with the 3 toes, and we put it with a modern horse, they're not going to recognize that each other are the same population or the same species. That's a temporal isolation. Now, obviously, we don't have a time machine. We can't go back and get a dawn horse and bring it to the modern times. But that's why the dawn horse and modern horses, despite the fact that they really were the same at some point, they're not considered the same species because they wouldn't recognize each other as the same species. Rates of evolution. Okay. Evolution can actually occur at different rates. I know I have said the entire time we've talked this unit how slow evolution is. Remember, we're going to be handling this as, it's relative. It's still slow, but we do have two different rates. The first is gradualism. That's what we think of. Over time, you get little tiny changes. So maybe we have this population and there's a mutation and it slowly changes a little bit. And then as they continue to grow, they continue to reproduce, they change a little bit more and then a little bit more and a little bit more. And then eventually 100 years have passed and now you have two very different looking organisms. Or you can have what's called punctuated equilibrium. Punctuated equilibrium is when you have periods of rapid change. So there's a massive mutation, a massive change in the environment that completely changes the equilibrium of the population of those alleles. And so that's what we're seeing here on the right, where this ancestor is blue, and then suddenly we have a pink variant that splits off into its own population. And that blue variant mutates, and we end up with a green variant that's better adapted. Over time, we end up with these massive changes very suddenly. We see this often in cases where there's been a catastrophe. There's been a major change in an area in the environment. Now, back in my day, they used to talk about gradualism versus punctuated equilibrium. The truth is both happen. We see gradualism in some populations. We see punctuated equilibrium in some populations. There's evidence for both. So it's likely that both types of evolution are occurring at the same time. We just, depending on our circumstances, might see one or we might see the other. Last points are extinction. Extinction just means the organism, the species is no longer there. You can actually have extinct, which means they're all gone, Or you can have organisms that are functionally extinct, which means they have so few individuals that there's no possibility for the population to recover. Background extinction occurs constantly. Small numbers of species go extinct every year. A mass extinction is when there's a huge change and a large number of species go extinct at one time. Think about the massive extinction of the dinosaurs. That's the one we always focus on. That was a mass extinction. So this has brought us to the end. Again, go back, rewatch whatever you need to. And of course, if you have questions, you can certainly ask them, and I will help you in any way that I can. I hope all of this has made sense, and I look forward to seeing you next time.